Imagine you are one of the most successful consumer brands of the modern era. You didn't just sell a product, you sold a lifestyle. You didn't just open stores, you retrained an entire generation how to socialize, how to work, how to kill time, how to signal taste and class. You weren't a coffee company. You were the coffee company. Now imagine that, quietly at first, the world you built that success on begins to dissolve. Not because people stopped liking coffee. Not because competitors suddenly became better overnight. But because the social, economic, and psychological conditions that made your business make sense no longer exist. That's the Starbucks story today. And no, this is not just about overpriced lattes, union drama, or TikTok boycotts. This is about something much deeper, the collapse of a business model that depended on slack time, slack money, slack attention, slack labor, slack urban space. When that slack disappears, Starbucks doesn't merely struggle. It becomes structurally incoherent. To understand why Starbucks is faltering, in the US, in China, and increasingly everywhere, you have to understand what it really sold in the first place. Starbucks' real invention wasn't espresso drinks. Italians figured that out a century earlier. What Starbucks invented was the third place, a semi-public, semi-private space between home and work where people could linger without obligation. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, this idea was revolutionary in the US. It worked because the economy allowed it to work. Real wages were rising. Commutes were tolerable. Office culture was less intense. People had time to sit. People had money to waste on a $4 drink. People had emotional bandwidth for ambience. By 2007, Starbucks had exploded from roughly 3,500 stores in 2000 to more than 15,000 globally. That kind of growth doesn't happen because coffee tastes good. It happens because the product fits the moment. But moments end. The 2008 financial crisis was the first crack. Starbucks survived it, but something changed. The company pivoted, subtly but decisively, from customer experience to shareholder extraction. Automation increased. Stores got busier but thinner. Labor got tighter. The third place slowly became a throughput machine. Then came the pandemic, and that was the kill shot. Post-pandemic America does not resemble pre-pandemic America. Nearly 60% of coffee in the US is now purchased via drive-thru, a figure that continues to rise year over year. People aren't looking for a place to sit. They're looking for speed. They're looking for caffeine as fuel, not ritual. And this is where Starbucks' pricing logic collapses. An $8 latte feels defensible if you're buying an hour of space, Wi-Fi, calm lighting, and psychological permission to exist without rushing. That same $8 latte feels absurd when you're handed a paper cup through a window and told to keep moving. Starbucks tried to adapt. Mobile ordering, pickup-only stores, drive-through expansion. But adaptation isn't transformation. The brand was still priced like a third place while being delivered like a vending machine. That gap is deadly. Customers noticed. Workers noticed faster. As Starbucks optimized for volume and margin, the actual in-store experience degraded. Long wait times. Skeleton staffing. Overworked baristas juggling 30 to 40 unfulfilled drinks at once. Food portions shrinking. Foam replacing liquid. Prices creeping up quarter after quarter. Starbucks still talked like a progressive, people-first company. It still called employees partners. But when workers began to unionize during the pandemic, the response wasn't dialogue. It was surveillance, firings, delay tactics, and legal warfare. By mid-2024, Starbucks stock had fallen roughly 15%, while sales dropped around 10%, driven by boycotts, inflation fatigue, and reputational damage. And this matters, because Starbucks' brand premium depended on moral credibility as much as taste. Once that credibility eroded, the price became naked. But if you think this story is only American, you're missing the bigger picture. For 2 decades, China was Starbucks' miracle market. A tea-drinking civilization of 1.4 billion people somehow convinced that coffee represented modernity, global belonging, and middle-class arrival. Starbucks didn't succeed in China by accident. It succeeded because it understood that Chinese consumers weren't buying coffee, they were buying status. A latte priced at roughly 30 renminbi, when bottled water cost 3 to 5 renminbi, was expensive by design. It signaled aspiration. By 2017, Starbucks controlled roughly 42% of China's coffee market, operated over 3,000 stores across 136 cities, and was opening a new location every 15 hours. China became its second largest market globally. The Shanghai Reserve Roastery wasn't just a store. It was a monument. A declaration that Starbucks wasn't a foreign brand operating in China, it was part of China's future. But here's the problem with selling status: status is relative. And once everyone has it, nobody does. When the middle class stopped feeling rich in post-2020 China, and the country is no longer similar to pre-2020 China, youth unemployment surged. The property market collapsed, wiping out perceived household wealth by 20 to 40% in many cases. Consumer confidence never truly recovered after zero-COVID lockdowns. And coffee, no matter how it's framed, is discretionary. Against the headwind, Starbucks continued adding stores, roughly 2,200 more between 2021 and 2024, yet revenue in China declined by about $700 million during the same period. That's a textbook sign of saturation under pressure. At the same time, domestic competitors weren't trying to replicate Starbucks' third-place fantasy. They were doing something far more dangerous. They were making Starbucks unnecessary. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: Starbucks didn't really lose to better coffee. It lost to a different economic logic. One that doesn't care about ambience. One that doesn't reward brand mythology. One that treats experience as friction, not value. And nowhere is that clearer than in the rise of Luckin Coffee. Luckin didn't ask, "How do we make people fall in love with coffee?" Luckin asked, "How do we remove everything that slows down coffee consumption?" No seating. No cash. No ordering at the counter. Everything through the app. QR codes instead of menus. Pickup counters instead of lounges. 1 or 2 baristas per location instead of 15. This wasn't aesthetic minimalism. It was cost annihilation. A Starbucks latte in China might cost 30 renminbi and cost around 8 renminbi to produce. Luckin figured out how to sell that same latte for 15 renminbi, often less after discounts, and still survive, because its fixed costs were radically lower. More importantly, Luckin wasn't optimizing for margin per drink. It was optimizing for transactions per minute. Every order generated data. Time of day. Location density. Promotion sensitivity. Inventory forecasting. Dynamic pricing. Starbucks, with its legacy store model and human-heavy workflows, simply couldn't match that speed. This wasn't a brand war. It was an operating system upgrade. Starbucks spent decades perfecting the human interface, the barista who knows your name, the ritual of ordering, the feeling of recognition. Luckin replaced all of that with algorithms. Discounts changed daily. Sometimes hourly. The app pushed coupons aggressively, so much so that paying full price became almost theoretical. Customers weren't asking, "Is this coffee good?" They were asking, "Why would I pay more elsewhere?" By 2024, Luckin had more than 6,000 additional stores compared to Starbucks in China, and had overtaken Starbucks in total revenue. And here's the key insight: Chinese consumers didn't betray Starbucks. They outgrew it. Starbucks' original China success depended on a rising middle class that wanted to be seen. Holding a Starbucks cup meant you were modern, global, upwardly mobile. But once coffee became normalized, once every office building had 3 options downstairs, that signaling power collapsed. At the same time, economic pressure intensified. Young consumers, especially those in their 20s and early 30s, were hit hardest by job insecurity, wage stagnation, and collapsing family wealth tied to real estate. Surveys consistently showed dining out and discretionary spending as the first categories to be cut. In that environment, Starbucks' refusal to discount aggressively wasn't brand discipline. It was arrogance. Eventually, Starbucks blinked. It started offering promotions in China, something it historically avoided. But by then, the brand had already lost its premium logic. Promotions lifted traffic, but average checks fell. Growth without profitability is not a turnaround. Publicly, Starbucks insists it is not exiting China. Privately, markets have circulated reports that Starbucks is exploring the sale of up to 70% of its China operations, valuing the business around $5 billion. That distinction matters. This isn't a retreat on surface but a retreat in reality. Selling a majority stake is an admission that the old model no longer works, and that local partners, with local cost structures, political fluency, and consumer instincts, are better suited to fight the next phase. And this is where the Starbucks story stops being about coffee. For decades, Western consumer brands believed they possessed something timeless, brand power that could be exported indefinitely. China was supposed to be the ultimate proof of that thesis. But China didn't just learn how to consume Western brands. It learned how to replace them. Luckin copied Starbucks' early playbook the same way Starbucks once copied Italian cafes, then stripped out everything inefficient. And now that logic is coming full circle. By 2025, Luckin had already opened several locations in New York City, explicitly testing whether its China-built, app-first, discount-heavy model could survive in Starbucks' home market. Early estimates showed those U.S. stores were not yet profitable, with monthly overheads around $92,000 and revenues closer to $85,000, but that misses the point. Luckin isn't testing profit but testing American consumers' behavior. If Americans, under inflation pressure and time scarcity, start choosing speed and price over vibes, Starbucks' moat disappears everywhere, not just in China. Starbucks thrived in a world that valued time to sit and relax, money to waste, labor willing to smile, cities designed for lingering, consumers willing to pay for symbolism. However, that world is shrinking. Today's economy rewards speed, automation, price transparency, data-driven operations, and no-frills delivery. Starbucks can tweak menus, rotate CEOs, and experiment with olive oil drinks. But unless the broader economy re-expands the kind of slack it once relied on, those fixes are cosmetic. This is not about bad management. It's about macroeconomic shift. Starbucks didn't suddenly become incompetent. The conditions that once made it brilliant simply stopped existing. The Starbucks Luckin story is not East versus West. It's not China versus America. It's not even coffee versus coffee. It's a warning about what happens when your business model depends on how people used to live instead of how they live now. In a world where consumers feel poorer, busier, more anxious, and less patient, brands built on softness, symbolism, and surplus will struggle unless they fundamentally rewire themselves. Starbucks might survive. It might even recover partially. But the era where it defined culture, dictated pricing, and expanded effortlessly across continents is over. And if you're a global brand still telling yourself, "Our story is timeless," Starbucks has a message for you that might not be always true.